Alrighty, so for my critical thinking project today, I'm going to be talking about GMOs and artificial selection. Now, when thinking about what topic I wanted to research into a deep dive on in this project, I wanted to do something that I kind of had a rough knowledge of just from growing up and hearing other people talk about it, but something that I didn't really have enough information about to make a quality opinion on it. So I was thinking about different things that related to this class, and I was reminded of a few years ago when my parents started trying a bunch of different diet fads and trends, and they were really looking into online what should be included in your diet and what shouldn't, and what's good for you and what's not. And I remember my mom, like a lot of millennial moms are avid, she was a avid Facebook user, and she kept seeing a bunch of articles about the dangers of GMOs and anti-GMO stuff and different posts about that. And I remember her being like, oh my gosh, I didn't know this. And she was kind of just believing exactly what she was reading. And I remember, as someone who is into biology and science, asking her like if she'd actually done research on it or if someone was just saying that. And I remember she just kind of brushed it off and was like, oh, I didn't look into it, but I don't think I need to. I believe what these people are saying. And that ended up being a vivid memory that came to mind. And it's something that, I have a rough basis of asking questions about already from a younger age. And it's also a topic that I was kind of ignorant on at the beginning. And so I thought that it would be a good time to pick a topic to research that I didn't really know a lot about and that I didn't really have a valid opinion on because I was kind of ignorant. So that is why I decided to talk about GMOs in artificial selection. Looking into some of the background information and the theories from our ecology and evolution class that relate to this topic. In chapter 7, we talked about evolution and population genetics, and we learned about two very important definitions that really were kind of the basic foundation for the rest of this project that we're going to build off of. The first of which being microevolution, which is when populations evolve over time, and the second of which being artificial selection, the act in which humans select which species and individuals will breed based on which specific traits they're trying to put together. And so a couple common examples of artificial selection. The first and probably most common is dog breeds. And obviously, in this presentation, I'm focusing on genetically modified organisms, more so like vegetables and fruits that are grown on farms and in crops and that are brought to the markets for consumers. But I wanted to include dog breeds because it is probably one of the more well-known and used ways of artificial selection. And dog breeds are a very common one that has been used by humans for a very, very long time. The second very common GMO is corn, and I have a picture of corn later on that shows what corn looked like before humans started genetically modifying it versus what it looks like now. And I'll point it out later in this presentation, but it was really wild in my research to come across that picture because it was just something that I didn't have any background knowledge of existing. I just kind of assumed that corn always just looked like how we know corn to be. But that's a really common one. And then my last really common one, just to kind of give a little bit more background information on what we're talking about, is mustards and leafy greens. So you'll see in this diagram on the left, the common ancestor for all these is wild mustards. But by humans picking and choosing which traits of this ancestor they wanted to use, through artificial selection, we were able to end up with all these different varieties of leafy greens that you see here. And so now that we have this, I just want to give a little bit more information on artificial selection, just really building up that foundation that we're starting out with, just to make sure that all of the background information and definitions are clear before we start getting into our scientific method and research. So the first big point about artificial selection is that it is based on human interference. So interference is really the main point here, and it can't happen without outside selection of traits and species mating. So without interference and human interference, artificial selection is not going to happen, hence the word artificial. My next point is I just want to make it clear the distinct difference between natural selection versus artificial selection. They are pretty similar, but natural selection is just that. It's naturally occurring evolution of traits over time. And so traits that are more fit for certain environments over time will become more prominent versus other traits that don't really help organisms and that make it harder for organisms to live and survive. Whereas artificial selection, it doesn't really matter necessarily which traits are suitable for a specific environment, but rather what scientists and humans are, what their end goal is, and what traits are necessary to get to that end goal. So those are just kind of the key distinctions between those different types of selection. But my next point, artificial selection has been used for centuries across many species. So going back to dog breeding, for example, is, again, one of the most common and longest used forms of artificial selection. It's been used for centuries back into the BC era. And even though heavy lab research on GMOs and modern-day GMOs have only really picked up and started in recent decades, this does show that it has actually been around as a practice for a very long time, which is just good background information to know when going into the rest of our research. And my last really big background point for foundational purposes is that there are objectively a lot of scientific benefits for GMOs and for GMO research. In general, GMOs are very useful for making different veggies and produce crops last longer on market shelves. It can make them look bigger and shinier and prettier and more aesthetically pleasing. And overall, this is all really good for shelf life and consumer market, but also just doing more research on GMOs really allows for advancements on artificial selection that can be used for other fields of research later on. So now that we have these basic definitions and backgrounds, now let's begin our deep dive into this information by going into more detail of our framework. And I want to start this off by referencing this article. It's called GMOs, Are You Feeding Them to Your Kids? And this is the article for me that really solidified that I was going to actually do my research on GMOs. I wanted to just kind of research different ideas before I really honed in on one. And this article is one of the first ones that I found about GMOs. And there's just so much to pick apart in this article that it really made me more confident in researching this because there are so many different viewpoints to think about. And I felt like this was a really good article to start out with when it comes to dissecting articles on credibility and accessibility and different things like that. So, like I said, there's a lot to pick apart here, which we'll get into later. But this article is a blog post from a website called the Jacksonville Mom. And it is a very strongly opinionated viewpoint about, it's very anti-GMO. And it just talks about this mom, Tiffany. She talks about how GMOs have been banned due to potential links to allergies and diseases and autoimmune issues, and how she doesn't want to feed them to her kids, and how she encourages people to not buy GMO products either. And seeing a viewpoint from someone who's a completely different demographic than me in age, she's an older adult with multiple young children, whereas obviously I am a 20-year-old college student who is not leading a family. And so seeing a completely different viewpoint than me and a completely different demographic being so passionate about this idea, it just made me really curious as to how many other viewpoints from different people there are on GMOs. And just reading this article just immediately, without me really thinking, raised a lot of questions for me. So with that being said, after reading this entire article and going through everything that was cited in this article, it led me to really three big important questions for my research. So the first question being, what are potential adverse effects of GMOs on human health as well as environmental health? And I think this is obviously a very important issue to discuss when talking about GMOs. And following that, on the flip side of that coin, is my second question, which is how can GMOs be helpful and beneficial in today's world? And now, obviously, these two questions really go hand in hand, and I wanted to address both of these questions, again, to get as many viewpoints as possible and to not potentially be biased in a way. I wanted to get an even amount of information on the negatives and the positives that are associated with artificial selection opinions and research. And then my third question is a little bit different than the first two. It's a little less scientific, but this question is, why exactly is the controversy about GMOs so strong? And another thing that I got from that blog post that I just showed you, another thing that I picked up on is that the Jacksonville Mom website, the author of this blog, Tiffany, was very strong, had a very strong opinion about GMOs, despite not having a lot of scientific background or having any personal experience with negative consequences of GMOs or anything. And again, linking back to my mom a couple years ago, looking into dieting and hearing so many adverse opinions on GMOs on Facebook pages and entire Facebook groups dedicated to talking about anti-GMO sources. And I was just kind of confused on why exactly has the controversy around this topic become so strong and so polarizing. So my goal by the end of this research is to be able to effectively answer all three of these questions with enough credible, accurate information to be able to form an opinion from the answers to each of these questions. So now that we have kind of dipped our toes into this topic and laid a solid framework and clearly defined our research questions, it's now time to continue on with the scientific method and gather info to weigh out all of the opinions that I was able to find online. So in order to start this deep dive into research, the question that was the basis of my research was, are the critiques of artificial selection on crops valid and based on scientific reasoning? And of course, with all research, it is really important to dissect things and make sure that you're finding a variety of primary, secondary, and tertiary sources, as well as different viewpoints, and making sure that credibility and accessibility is there. And before I get further into that, I do want to point you to this picture on the right that I mentioned earlier. I was going to show you a picture of corn. So you'll see the very left picture of corn is what corn looked like in the world before human artificial selection came into play. And you can kind of see how corn changed over time in nature because of artificial selection of certain traits. And you'll see it does provide, obviously corn now is much bigger and wider than it used to be and has more kernels that we can actually eat. So that just kind of shows the significance of artificial selection and exactly just how much it can change an organism in a whole species. And so that's just a side note, but I just thought that was really interesting and I wanted to share that because I found it. And then up in the right corner here is the link to this picture. But anyways, back into our deep dive. So looking at my main research question, and really aiming to answer my other three questions at hand that I just showed you. Again, I wanted to get a mix of different types of sources. So in order to do this, I just started in plain old Google, and I wanted to start by looking at tertiary sources and work my way up to primary sources. So I did this by starting in Google rather than Google Scholar, and I used key searches that would try to get me as many tertiary sources as possible and as many opinions from just regular day individuals and less scientists that I knew I would get from my primary and my secondary sources. So my keywords for finding tertiary sources were anti-GMO blogs, pro-GMO blogs, public opinions on GMOs, stuff like that, in order to get as many kind of basic societal opinions as possible. And after finding quite a few tertiary sources, and then I ended up finding more later on accident while I was trying to find primary and secondary sources, after I found enough tertiary sources to my liking, I then moved to Google Scholar for my secondary and primary sources. So in order to find these two types of sources, I kind of changed my vocabulary in my key searches. So Googling GMO research, GMO benefits and disadvantages, scientific research on GMOs, experiments on GMOs, things like that. The only difference for these being that when I was looking specifically for secondary sources, I included the word reviews and assessments into my key searches. And overall, this ended up being very successful. And I was able to find a lot of sources, which you'll see in a minute, that gave me a wide variety of viewpoints and opinions and statistics that really helped me form really valid opinions on all of this. And with that being said, here are those sources. In total, I found 12 sources, 2 primary, 2 secondary, and 8 tertiary. It was not originally my goal to find that many tertiary sources. I honestly wanted it to be a bit more even, but in hindsight, I was really focusing on getting as many different opinions as possible, and the best way to get those opinions was through blog sources, which are tertiary sources. So I just want to give a brief overview of each of these sources. So the first one is by Tashiko from 2011, and the assessment of the impact of GMO of plant origin on rat progeny development in 3 generations. And this article was very helpful to me. Later I'll identify which of these were my key sources, but this gave me a lot of information. It was very easy to read as well, but it talked about how over 3 generations, GMO chemicals were tested on different rat generations. They ended up testing over 3,000 rats in total, both adult and adolescent rats. And it ended up being found at the end of this longitudinal study that there were no negative effects from these GMO chemicals on the rats. And so that was really important to help me answer that second question at hand as to or my first question at hand, of what potential adverse effects were from GMOs. And it also helped me refute many answers that I got of that first question of what are adverse effects of GMOs. And it helped me refute with fact and with lab statistics. Now moving to my second article. This is the Bennett 2004 article. At first glance, it seems like it might be a secondary article because it says a life cycle assessment, but in actuality, after reading it, it is indeed a primary source. And it is talking about how they grew a genetically modified sugar beet that is herbicide tolerant, and they ended up testing this against different participants of how it potentially impacted animal testing health to then describe how it would potentially impact human health. And again, at the end of this experiment, it ended up being found as they studied these lab animals over time as they got older and then eventually died. Again, it ended up being found that there were no significant negative effects from GMOs on these participants. And overall, this wasn't as useful to my information as the first primary source, but it did give me more background information for me to personally understand and dissect the other articles better. And also just gave me good experience in reading more primary sources. Now, looking at my secondary sources, the first one is this Rahman 2017 article, The Impact of GM Crops in Modern Agriculture. And this one was also very useful to me. It was a very in-depth review. And again, it really helped answer the first and the second questions. More so answering my first question of what negative effects of GMOs are by refuting common misconceptions about negative effects about GMOs. Whereas on the flip side, by refuting those arguments, it gave me a lot of statistically significant data to show that there are not a lot of GMO negative effects that have been shown on humans or on animals or in labs or anything like that. Now looking at the next article, the Phillips 2008 article about transgenic crops and recombinant DNA technology. You can probably tell from the title, but again, this wasn't as useful towards my information. This was focusing more on the process of developing GMOs. But with that being said, it didn't really help answer any of my research questions, but it did give me just more background information on how exactly the process of making GMOs and artificial selection works, which then helped me to understand the rest of the articles better. Now, looking into my tertiary sources, I know it's a lot, but my first one is the Sorensen 2018 article in defense of genetically modified food. And I really liked this article. The author did not have any scientific background. It was just a regular person giving their own opinion on GMOs. But I really liked it because I kept finding a lot of blogs that were purely extremely anti-GMO. And I kept searching until I could find more blogs that were actually defending GMOs. A lot of people online like to argue and complain about things rather than kind of defend and refute those things. And so it was nice to see just another side of the story, and someone who had a different opinion. And this did help me to answer my second question, not necessarily with data and statistics like a primary source would, but it did help me get more public opinions to answer my second question of what different benefits of GMOs are and what those are perceived as to the public. Then moving on to my next article, this is actually a Khan Academy video that was posted in 2019. And I really liked this article because kind of similarly to the beginning, when I explained the difference between natural selection and artificial selection, I just really liked how this article broke it down and again gave me more confidence that I knew exactly what the differences between these types of selections were before I continued my research. And so, it didn't really help answer any of my research questions, and it didn't give any data or statistics or anything, but it was very good for laying an even more solid foundation of understanding the definitions and basic info. Now, the next one is the Tiffany 2013 blog post that I showed at the beginning of this presentation, the GMOs, Are You Feeding Them to Your Kids? And again, I'm going to pick this apart later in the presentation very shortly, but this is a very aggressive anti-GMO blog post. And again, this was the basis of my want to research this topic because it provoked all of my research questions immediately upon reading it. And it was just so divisive, and I'll show you exactly later why it intrigued me so much. But this one did not really answer my research questions that much, but it did kind of help explain to me why the controversy around GMOs is so intense and what people's intentions are by displaying anti-GMO opinions. And then the next article kind of ties to that. It is the Gunlock 2013 article about mommy blogs and parenting sites taking over the fight against GMOs. Again, this one also really helped answer that third question that I had earlier of why is the controversy around GMOs so strong and polarizing. And again, it's just very interesting as someone who's not a mom and not a parent or has a family to read common viewpoints of those demographics who are anti-GMO and what their reasoning and intentions are. So it helped answer my third question a lot about the controversy and also helped me gain public opinion on what some very common negative thoughts about GMOs are. Looking at my next article, the Farmer's Daughter blog post by Schoenfelder 2018. I really liked this article. It wasn't the most credible, and again, it is just a tertiary source, so it didn't have any scientific evidence to back it up. But it was really cool to see an opinion from a farmer's and a farmer family point of view, because all of my other data, I didn't really find any data on what farmers were thinking about all of this. And obviously, they are the ones that kind of are the most influential in producing GMO crops or not. So it was just really cool to see that. And it was also really cool to see an article written by a kid. This blog post, like it says, is written by a farmer's daughter. And in the article, she includes pictures from the farm and talks about just her experience growing up on the farm and how GMOs have been really helpful to their family and just financially being more secure because of GMO usage. And overall, it was just really cool to read. I just really enjoyed reading it as a blog post. And it did help answer my second question about what helpful, beneficial things GMOs has provided for people. And again, even though it was not using statistics or data or scientific research to answer that question. It did answer it through personal experience, through living on a farm and working with GMOs, which I really enjoyed. Looking at the next article, this is the Tongue 2019 article, Why Opposition to GMOs is a First World Privilege. And this article is really interesting. It was not really centered around the same info that I was looking for when it came to answering my research questions, but it did bring up a really good point that I didn't originally think of. And it did really make me more passionate about my research in this topic because, I was kind of focusing a lot on U.S. Opinions on GMOs. All of these other articles are written by people who live and do research in the U.S. And later I will explain some government websites that I found from the U.S. federal government. And so this was just really good to think about because it pointed out a lot of good points of there are a lot of third world countries where GMOs could really help them have more access to food. And so it just brought up a good point of how there's a really clear contrast between people online complaining about this scientific technology that is becoming more influential until today's world, where on the flip side, you have people who really kind of need something like this in order to live. And so it didn't really answer any of my research questions. It kind of answered why it could be helpful and beneficial using more GMOs, but not really in scientific data terms. But overall, I did really like that article, and it was just really interesting to read and made me more passionate and a little bit angry, honestly, on how people have complained about GMOs so much without doing any research or thinking about any other types of people in different situations. So, yeah. And then my last two articles, the first one is from the World Health Organization from 2014, and the second one is from the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. And both of these are obviously from federal websites, and I really liked these articles. When I was beginning research, I didn't even think to look at their websites until I just happened to stumble across it. But both of these articles were very good. They helped answer my research question of what the benefits are of GMOs and how they can be helpful, and also refuted a lot of the flashback that I saw of public opinion of not liking GMOs. And I liked how they just, in both articles, they clearly list out questions that people in the public have had, and then immediately answer them with kind of step-by-step bullet points of what their regulation process looks like. And so overall, after reading all these articles, they all really brought something to the table for me. And now that we have this kind of brief overview of all the sources that I found, it's now time to identify the key sources that really guided the answers to my research questions the most. And then from there, I'm going to critically examine each and disregard any of the incredible sources. And unfortunately, that does mean that a lot of these tertiary sources that I enjoyed and liked reading do need to be disregarded because their points are not really backed with reliable evidence and science, but rather just with basic opinions. But I do feel like it was necessary to describe each of these to you, so that way you can see all the different viewpoints that I found on this topic and everything that I took into consideration during my research methods. And it really did help to show me the opinions that have become so aggressive and polarizing online. So now you will see 3 stars next to all 3 of my key sources that I picked out. My primary source about the rat testing of GMOs, followed by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration website, and then finally in the middle, my tertiary source from the Jacksonville Mom website, the blog post that was anti-GMO. And I do want to point out that the Tiffany 2013 article, you'll find out as I explain in the next few slides that it is not credible, but I did want to dissect it for you because it was not a key source in giving me valid data, but it was a key source in starting my research and making it the most clear to me on why exactly it is important to do all this intense research that I've shown you before believing what you see. So even though it's not backed in scientific evidence at all, and key sources need to be credible, this actually really is one of my key sources, though, because it really proved to me the whole importance of this critical thinking assignment to begin with. So now is where I get into the critical examination of each of these key sources. So we're going to start with the credible sources and then move on to that blog post. So I actually want to show you what each of these articles look like. So this first one is the primary source about the rat progeny development by the Tashiko 2011 article. And as you can see, it's laid out really nicely. I won't go through the whole thing, but it's got abstract, introduction, conclusion, everything. I actually clicked on each of these individual authors when I first found it, and each of them have written numerous other primary articles, which was a really good sign too. And overall, I mean, this is just a very clean website, but when talking about credibility, I also want to talk about accessibility, because in the world of science, I really believe that if you want to get your opinions across to the general public, you need to make your websites and your data easy to understand for people who aren't just scientists and researchers, even in primary sources. I really do believe that, so I wanted to focus on accessibility as well. And after downloading this article and reading the entire thing, it really was fairly easy to understand. In the abstract alone, it lays out everything, ending with the data on how the impact of the GMO corn that they gave the rat generations. It just really showed, everything very clearly. I'm kind of rambling, but anyways, back to the critical examination. So it was published in 2011, so fairly recent. Within the past 10 to 15 years, closer to the 10 and under side is really where you want to be when it comes to scientific research, in order to be as credible and relevant as possible. And, 2011 could be slightly better, but is really pretty good for especially a longitudinal study that took them a very long time. And then, like I just said, it was written by researchers and scientists, and they have written multiple other articles and been a part of other research as well, which was a green flag. Also, in the citations portion at the end of their article, they cite throughout their report to other primary articles, which is also very good because they are using other scientific reviewed sources to back up what they're saying, which is very important when it comes to credibility. And overall, they really clearly outlined the data, procedures, really everything that should be involved in a lab report very thoroughly, while not being overwhelming and still being very clear to read and understand, even if you have no scientific experience. And so overall, this was an extremely credible source after I kind of examined everything that I just showed you, and was a relevant source as well and valid in what it was saying. Now going to the second article, the How GMOs Are Regulated in the United States. So just clicking on this website again, I just want to show you the layout. And you can tell with this FDA website, they really are focusing on making it easy for the general public to understand, which I really appreciated when it came to the accessibility portion of what I was looking for. And you see they use nice infographics and stuff. And they explain not only what they do, but what other federal agencies also look for when it comes to regulating GMOs. And they reference a lot of other links to other credible sources and federal things. And they also link videos, which also made it even more accessible, especially when thinking about teaching children and younger people about different scientific things going on in the world. I think that's also really important when it comes to accessibility. And so overall, this layout was just done very well. But obviously that is not the main contender for looking at credibility or not. So now I want to, really break down the credibility portion, not just the accessibility. And so this article, it did not say when it was actually published, but it was updated in 2014, which honestly is even better to see because it shows that they are actively updating their information as rules and regulations change over time. And again, this is directly from the FDA website, and being a federal website, it does confirm that it is extremely credible in what it is saying and that it is actively displaying what the federal government is actually doing, which was another green flag. It also, like I showed you through the layout, clearly outlines how the FDA goes through the process of allowing GMOs and explaining which government agencies are actually involved and what the procedures are, and just ensuring to the public that they know what they're doing and that they have a clear plan laid out, which is also very important, especially when trying to refute myths and misconceptions that are spread along the internet. So overall, this was, again, another very credible and relevant source, and it very clearly refuted anti-GMO backlash, really even better than the primary source that we looked at. Which then, on the flip side, leads me to our last article, the Tiffany 2013 article, GMOs, Are You Feeding Them to Your Kids? So I'm just going to pull that up really quick, just so you can see the entire thing. I know I showed a picture of it earlier, but there's just so much to go through here that I really want to make sure that I show you just exactly like how much I had to dissect, because there was so much stuff to unpack here when it came to validity and credibility, or really the lack thereof. And also I just wanted to point out, you'll see in this corner right here, this blog has a lot of followers and fans. And as I dissect this, you'll see that this is actually really concerning, especially considering the fact that none of this that I'm about to show you is backed in scientific reasoning, and yet all of these people are heavy supporters of this person and this blog. So, starting just as an overview, I just want to show the different things that they're linking to. So the first thing that Tiffany links in this article is another blog post from someone else that is also not based on scientific evidence. And then later down, there's a couple links to different web pages and grocery stores, which was just really kind of unnecessary and insignificant. And then at the very bottom, after not really saying any scientific information, links this thing called the Non-GMO Project. And this is where our dissection into this credibility really comes into play. So at first glance, this looks like a very professional, kind of stereotypically scientific looking article. It's very clean. You look at the bottom and you're like, oh, it has 10 sources. That's really great. And then you look at the names of these sources and they look like legit science articles. But as you begin to actually open your eyes and look at what you're looking at, it is really just, it honestly just kind of blew my mind how terribly this was put together, for lack of better words. But immediately, as I was like, man, these are a lot of scientific sources. They really did their research. But as I read them, my first really big red flag was that of these 10 sources, the first 5 are the same exact things as 6 through 10. They were just repeated twice. And now you could say that this is a mistake, but you could also say that they doubled the amount of sources that they showed in order to make it seem at first glance, assuming that people aren't going to read them, that they've done more research than they actually have. So that was something that really kind of caught me off to begin with and made me pay attention to the rest of it even more. And after kind of browsing through these different sources, many of them are primary and secondary sources and are actually backed by scientific evidence. But you'll see, as they are actually cited throughout this article, the way that they are cited is manipulated in such a way to give sources, but don't really make sense with the context that they're being put into. So you'll see this first citation is just linked to a general statement that GMO crops do exist in North America, which again is a fact, but did not need to be linked to a scientific article. And these scientific articles, many of them actually were defending GMO use and supported GMO use, where obviously this is called the non-GMO project. So it was just very clear that the author here was intentionally using scientific sources to look like they had done research, when in actuality, they were just using it as kind of a ploy. And same thing with that source. As you go down, the same thing happens multiple times. This is being quoted for just a statistic with no opinion added onto it, or no indication of adverse effects of GMOs or anything like that. And then this other one is another really key point that stuck out to me. And it says right here, I'm going to highlight it for you. It talks about how the World Health Organization supposedly determined that a specific chemical used in the GMO process is likely carcinogenic to humans. And I just immediately saw that and just had a gut feeling like that was not real. And so I actually went to the World Health Organization because there was not a link to this direct quote, which again really showed a lack of credibility there as well. But I actually went to the World Health Organization and went in Google and typed in this specific quote unquote direct quote that doesn't actually exist. And through actually a lot more research than I probably should have went through in order to find this direct quote, I ended up determining that it simply does not exist, and this author purely just made it up. And so looking at all these different things, again, just really showed that these authors of the Tiffany 2013 blog, as well as the Non-GMO Project blog, really both authors had absolutely no scientific background. The citations and links were not credible at all. And the ones that were not credible in terms of the context that they were being used in. And overall just were not used correctly. And the opinions of these actual authors were extremely opinionated. So overall, these opinions are relevant just because, the Tiffany blog was published in 2013, which is fairly recent. And the Non-GMO Project was posted in 2016, which is also very recent. But at the end of the day, even though they're relevant to the current times, they're not valid at all and they're not credible at all. So now that I've really shown you what I learned through the process of critically examining sources, now that we've really zoomed in on this topic and applied the information that we learned from these original sources, I just want to kind of move on to the next topic, which I just want to compare and contrast the very popular and common anti-GMO versus pro-GMO opinions that I found on the internet, just to give kind of zoom out a little bit and give a brief overview, since I just kind of gave information overload on critically examining and picking apart all these articles. So moving to my compare and contrast portion, that really were the key answers to my research questions. First, I just want to overview some popular anti-GMO opinions. The first one being that a lot of the public opinions are that GMOs can be harmful for children and for the environment. As we saw in that Tiffany 2013 post and the Non-GMO Project, people are really worried about their kids, and mommy blogs and Facebook pages have been some of the main ways that people have talked about that. And that was one of the very glaring main opinions that I found on the internet. Another key anti-GMO popular opinion is that a lot of people feel like not enough research has been done to know the adverse effects on GMOs, which through my research, that has obviously been refuted, and I will show all of the kind of rebuttals with data to that in a minute. But yeah, a very common theme is that people just don't feel like enough scientific research has been done to feel comfortable putting GMOs in their body. And the next one is very similar to that point, which is that a lot of people feel like the chemicals that are used in the making of GMOs can cause different health issues and can be bad for the environment, and overall are just over time going to show negative effects on human health in a variety of ways. And then the last really key main point is really helped me understand why the controversy is so strong around GMOs. But the last point is that a lot of people do not trust the federal government, especially in the US, about how they're handling the potential dangers of GMOs that they feel exist, and really feel like the US government just hasn't been very truthful and kind of lacks very delicate regulations, and are kind of just looking to make more profit by making bigger, prettier produce to go on the market. And now on the flip side of that, I just want to, again, briefly overview the pro-GMO public opinions that I found, just kind of giving an overview of all of those 12 sources that I went through. The first point being that GMOs, people feel like GMOs are very helpful for farmers and for keeping up with the demands of crops and food as not even just the US population, but our global population rapidly grows. And then that leads me into my second point, that a lot of people feel like the topic of GMOs have become aggressively demonized by the public and have become very polarizing, like I mentioned at the beginning. But they do feel like it is still important, more than ever, to continue research and innovation on this artificial selection technology. And then my third really key public opinion that I found are that a lot of people feel GMOs are helpful to develop as, like I said, with human population growing, but also as climate change and more environmental negative factors continue on and come into play. I will touch on that again later, but that was also a very glaring issue that people had online as well. And then my last point is that a lot of people, when it comes to GMOs, they have recognized that GMOs are on the market when they go to the grocery stores. And by that means that they've been approved by the US federal government and scientists and federal agencies like the FDA. And so a lot of people, feel, oh, well, if these are available for me to buy, then surely that means that they're okay for me to eat and that they're not going to cause any problems for me and my health in the future. And so now that I've outlined really the main key things for both arguments, I want to give specific rebuttals. So the first really main argument that I found was refuted with my research was that people, again, feel like the dangers of GMOs haven't been researched enough. But as we found with my primary source, the Tashiko 2011 article researching GMO effects on generations of rats, as well as my secondary source, the Raman 2017 article giving an overview of different research that's happened in the past few decades, we've clearly seen with credible scientific evidence that many experiments and research have in fact been done on GMOs for decades. And like I mentioned earlier, GMO usage has been around for centuries, really. And so overall, that was just kind of immediately refuted through my scientific data that I found through these primary and secondary resources, that these really have been researched very thoroughly. And simply put, the GMOs that have been approved do not have any dangers scientifically associated with them. And then my second argument that I found a rebuttal to was that a lot of people feel like the government hasn't been open to their methods of allowing GMOs on the market and feel like they haven't been very truthful. And although this kind of polarizing topic of government and political views have become more prevalent over time, through my websites that I found, like the FDA and the World Health Organization websites that I showed you, they both, as federal agencies, really outlined their processes and regulations very well. And like I showed you by showing you the actual FDA website, it was laid out very well. It very clearly refuted this argument by explaining step by step and in bullet points exactly what their criteria were and what agencies were involved. So overall, that argument just is really insignificant and is not based in any scientific reasoning or evidence at all. And then that leads me to my third and last main anti-GMO argument that all of that research I showed you really boils down to, which that people still believe that certain chemicals found in GMOs have been and will continue to be found to be harmful to humans and human health. And kind of similar to the first argument that I just went over, this is blatantly false. Research and data, again, that Tashiko primary article and that Raman 2017 secondary review article that I found, both clearly show through scientific evidence and numerous experiments done over the past many decades that there are no negative effects on GMOs currently on the market. And as GMOs become more and more prevalent and scientists study them more and more experiments are going to continue to happen in order to determine if they are safe to go on the market or not. So I just want to tie that all together now. We are nearing the end of my presentation, but I really just want to start by talking about how this critical thinking project has taught me to critically think very well and has really taught me the importance of fact-checking. Obviously, I've written lab reports before as a biology student, and I've already known the importance of fact-checking for a very long time, but I really gave people the benefit of the doubt, and I really just didn't realize until now the extent that people will go to make their opinions seem credible. It really just blew my mind, especially that Tiffany 2013 article in the Non-GMO Project. Just the way that they manipulated their information to make it seem so real. I can't even really fault people for believing what these people are saying because, if you don't understand the importance of fact-checking and doing your own intense research before you make opinions, it's very easy to fall for. And so that kind of just really opened my eyes and really taught me that not even in just this project, which I did apply it to as I found each of my 12 sources, but it really just opened my eyes to, in the future, when I'm researching anything, to not just believe exactly what I'm seeing and just assume that these people know what they're talking about, but online or even in person, or as I potentially conduct my own experiments in the future, write my own lab reports, to just really make sure that I am being credible and that any research that I'm taking into consideration is credible as well. And then, so that kind of leads me into my personal opinions. That really was my main takeaway, just really the importance of fact-checking. But now looking at my personal opinions of GMOs as the topic, based on all this data that I found and really analyzing what was credible and what was just kind of invalid information of people just complaining about things that they didn't have any evidence for to believe in, I am pro-GMO. I really, looking at these different things, especially that Tongue 2019 article about how it is really a privilege to even begin to kind of complain about GMO usage in the U.S. It really just showed me that I think GMO research could really be beneficial, not just in the U.S., but really globally. There's so many problems going on in the world right now. I mean, as the U.S. kind of enters another recession coming out of COVID-19, as climate change continues all around the globe, and as third world countries still do not have access to food, and as certain areas of the world are not able to grow certain crops like other places are, I really do think that GMOs can really be a key solution for many of these problems. And so it is something that I want to continue to keep tabs on outside of this project. And overall, it was something that I wasn't really passionate about at the beginning. I picked it because I thought it fit the requirements well, and because I had kind of heard about it from my parents and a little bit online. But this now is something that I want to start conversations about with people and peers that I know, and that I want to continue to keep tabs on as more and more GMO research and innovations happen in the next few years and decades as I continue to grow up. And so now I just kind of want to wrap this up by addressing my 3 beginning research questions. And we kind of just went over the first 2 in my compare and contrast portion. But now I really want to focus in on that third question of exactly how I believe the controversy around GMOs has become so strong. And I just want to put even more emphasis on it now and talk about the really kind of false information and misconceptions that have occurred around GMOs. And now, obviously, like I just said, the topic of GMOs online is a really hot topic. People have very strong opinions on it, and for that reason, a lot of people are kind of scared to talk about it online, and the ones who do receive a lot of flashback, and overall, there's just a lot of tension. It's a very polarizing topic. And so I want to address, after thinking about it, 2 solutions that I feel like could really help with this tension. And so my first point is that I really feel like there's just not a lot of trust between society and science, as well as society and the government. So when it comes to federal agencies being the ones who are in charge of approving GMOs to be put on the market, I feel like this innovation and technology has just immediately become linked with politics, which is increasingly more and more intense over time. And so my first solution that I think could really help ease this public tension is that I feel like websites like the FDA and the World Health Organization that I showed you earlier, I feel like these federal agencies should be even more open about their GMO protocols and regulations. Personally, I felt like they already did a really good job at laying that out, but I feel like that by showing what GMOs they have not allowed to become on the market because they were deemed unsafe, I feel like being more open about the failures of GMO technology as well as the successes will build even more trust between the government, farmers, and the public, and anyone involved in this topic, by showing that these agencies are in fact looking out for us and are actively disapproving things that do not fit the necessary criteria. And then my second point, another reason I think public tension around GMOs is so strong is because as social media has begun to rise more and more and more since the early 2000s, it's just very clear that a lot of false information and myths are spread like wildfire on the internet. It's very hard to pick apart things online and figure out what's real and what's fake without doing intensive research like this project. And so overall, I feel like a good solution for easing this tension would be for the field of science to really utilize social media and the internet more as an education platform. Personally, I just really feel like the world of science is really missing out on a huge opportunity to use social media more and more to get younger generations passionate and educated on the field of science as a whole. I just feel like it's been kind of glossed over by a lot of the scientific community. And so by utilizing social media more to educate the public on a wider scale with scientific data that is accessible and easy to understand, by doing this, it can really help diminish the spread of false information. And now, based on these solutions that I've come up with, especially the topic of social media, this kind of segues into how I personally would spread my conclusions that I just showed you in this entire project to the general public. And so I really thought about this. I really immersed myself into this topic as if this is something I would genuinely be doing as like a career for the rest of my life. And so I really thought about it, and by using social media, I would want to make some sort of content company, very similar to kind of the Amoeba Sisters that we've watched in class, or Crash Course videos, especially Crash Course Science. Both of these are very well-known social media companies. And so I would want to start up a company exactly like that. I would want to hire not just focusing on content creators and marketing media teams, but also hiring real scientists who have actually done experiments in lab work and have a lot of hands-on background when it comes to different scientific arguments. And I would want to create, starting out on YouTube, I would want to create long-form content that specifically focuses on kind of debunking different common misconceptions that are found online, kind of like Mythbusters, but mixed with like Crash Course in the Amoeba Sisters. And so I would start out with GMOs as my main piece that I would want to talk about online. So I would start by doing long form videos on YouTube. I'm talking about GMOs and making all that information that I just gave you more palatable and accessible for younger generations and for anybody who comes across them to be able to understand. And this is why I would want to hire scientists and really focus on the scientific portion of this, because at the end of the day, it's less about the aesthetics and how it looks online and more about what information is actually being shared. And so I would start, again, with those long videos on YouTube, laying out the data that my scientific researchers would find and making it eye-catching and easy to understand and read, and making it really engaging so that way viewers get interested in it and develop an understanding for why it's important to debunk common scientific misconceptions. And then from there, I would also want to use Instagram and TikTok, which are two of the highest growing social media platforms right now, especially TikTok. And I would want to move there as well, just to get more advertising for those long form YouTube videos. And so on TikTok, I would want to post clips of those YouTube videos, as well as kind of shorter versions, debunking different things that kind of don't take as long, as well as making videos specifically not debunking specific topics, but rather explaining the importance of credibility online and doing quick little videos on kind of a crash course on how to determine what's credible and what's not online very quickly. And then on Instagram, I would want to do the same thing, but I also would kind of want to take a different direction with each app that I used through my company. And on Instagram, I would want to make infographics and kind of overview visuals on each video that is posted, and then post those infographics and statistics online on Instagram for people to share and link back to the YouTube channel. And so I really feel like by using social media in this way, I would be able to rapidly grow an interest of people who want to learn more about science. But not only that, but just teaching people in general how to think critically, how to go through the scientific method, not just in science, but when thinking about anything. And so overall, that is the conclusion to my project. I hope that you've taken a lot away from this. You've probably learned more about GMOs than you ever thought you would without doing your own research. But thank you for listening. I had a really good time making this. It was definitely hard, I'm not going to lie. It was hard to go through so many different research articles and pick out what was important, what was credible, what wasn't, what to ignore, what to listen to, etc. And so overall, thank you for listening. And here is my first page of works cited. And here is my second. So thank you for listening. Bye.